The desert has a way of keeping secrets. In the high plains of northern Nevada, where the sagebrush stretches endlessly beneath a sky so wide it feels like falling, the land swallows things whole. Footprints vanish in the wind. Voices get lost in the silence. And sometimes people disappear without leaving so much as a shadow behind. For 22 years, the town of Winnemucca held its breath, waiting for answers that never came. The case files gathered dust in cardboard boxes at the back of the sheriff's office. The headlines faded from yellow newsprint into nothing. The families aged, their hope eroding like sandstone under relentless sun. Until March 17, 2025, when a single phone call changed everything. The arrest that followed didn't just solve a murder. It tore open old wounds, exposed buried lies, and forced an entire community to confront a truth so disturbing that many still refuse to believe it. Because the person led away in handcuffs that morning wasn't some drifter passing through, wasn't some stranger with dead eyes and a violent past. It was someone they'd trusted for decades. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how this happened, to truly grasp the horror of what unfolded in the spring of 2003, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when Winnemucca was just another quiet town where everybody knew everybody, where doors stayed unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. Back to the last time anyone saw Melissa Harding alive. April 3, 2003. Thursday evening. The temperature had dropped to 48 degrees after a warm afternoon, and the wind carried the smell of coming rain. Melissa, 23 years old, a recent graduate from the University of Nevada with a degree in elementary education, had spent the day substitute teaching at Lowry High School. Her students would later describe her as patient, kind, always willing to stay after class to help anyone struggling with their work. She was supposed to meet her younger sister Jamie at the Silver Dollar Casino at 7 o'clock. They had plans to grab dinner at the Griddle restaurant, maybe catch a movie afterward. Nothing special. Just two sisters spending time together on a Thursday night. Melissa never showed up. At 7:15, Jamie called her sister's cell phone. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. That she left a message, her tone light teasing. "Where are you? Did you forget about me? Call me back. Where to? Lana's totally back." At 7:30, she called again. Voicemail. At 8 o'clock, Jamie drove to Melissa's apartment on West Winnemucca Boulevard, a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex called Desert View. The parking lot was poorly lit, shadows pooling between the few working street lamps. Melissa's car, a 1998 Honda Civic in dark green, sat in its assigned spot. The hood was cold to the touch. Jamie knocked on the apartment door. No answer. She knocked harder, calling her sister's name. The neighbor from across the hall, an elderly woman named Dorothy Simmons, poked her head out and said she'd seen Melissa come home around 5:30, carrying her work bag and a brown paper grocery sack. Dorothy remembered because she'd waved, and Melissa had smiled back, said something about finally trying that new pasta recipe she'd been talking about. That was the last confirmed sighting. But Jamie used the spare key Melissa had given her months earlier. But the apartment was unlocked. She pushed open the door and immediately knew something was wrong. The lights were on. Every single one. The living room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, all blazing. The television sat dark and silent. On the kitchen counter, groceries remained unpacked, the paper bag tipped on its side. A box of penny pasta, a jar of marinara sauce, fresh basil still in its plastic container, and the package of ground beef that had started to turn warm. Melissa's purse lay on the floor near the couch, its contents spilled across the carpet. Wallet, lipstick, car keys, a paperback novel with a bookmark halfway through. Her cell phone rested on the coffee table, screen dark, battery dead. In the bedroom, the closet door stood open. Clothes hung undisturbed. The bed was made. Nothing appeared stolen. No signs of forced entry. No blood. No struggle. Just an eerie, hollow absence, as if Melissa had simply evaporated mid-task. Jamie called 911 at 8:42 p.m. The Winnemucca Police Department responded within minutes. Officer Dale Pittman arrived first, a 15-year veteran who'd known the Harding family since Jamie and Melissa were kids. He walked through the apartment with growing unease, his hand resting on his radio as he checked each room. His report, filed later that night, noted the strange tableau of abandoned normalcy. A life interrupted mid-breath. By 10 o'clock, the apartment had become a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the doorway. Evidence technicians photographed every surface, dusted for prints, collected fibers and samples. Detective Laura Vance, lead investigator for major crimes, stood in the living room and tried to construct a narrative from the silence. Theory 1: Melissa had come home, started unpacking groceries, then left voluntarily with someone she knew. But her car was still there. Her purse was still there. And according to phone records pulled later, she hadn't made or received any calls after 5:15 that afternoon. Theory 2: someone had been waiting inside the apartment. But the door showed no signs of forced entry, and Dorothy Simmons insisted she'd been home all evening, would have heard any commotion through the thin walls. Theory 3: something had happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, that Melissa hadn't had time to resist or call for help. But what? And how? And where was she now? The search began at dawn. Volunteers spread across Winnemucca like ants, checking alleys, vacant buildings, abandoned mines in the surrounding hills. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the desert. Search dogs tracked scents that led nowhere, circling back to the apartment parking lot and stopping cold. Local news stations ran Melissa's photograph every hour. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 5'6", 120 pounds, last seen wearing jeans and a white sweater. Her parents, Richard and Susan Harding, appeared at a press conference 3 days later. Richard stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. But Susan held a framed photo of her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she begged anyone with information to come forward. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, if you know anything, if you saw anything, please help us bring our baby home." The tips flooded in. Hundreds of them. Someone claimed they'd seen a woman matching Melissa's description at a gas station in Elko. Another caller swore they'd spotted her hitchhiking near Interstate 80. A psychic from California contacted the police, insisting she'd had a vision of Melissa trapped in an old mining shaft west of town. And every lead was followed. Every lead went cold. Detective Vance worked the case obsessively. But she interviewed Melissa's friends, co-workers, former boyfriends. She pulled financial records, looking for unusual transactions or withdrawals. She examined Melissa's computer, a bulky Dell desktop, searching through emails and browser history for anything suspicious. Nothing. Nothing. Melissa had been planning her future. She'd applied for full-time teaching positions at 3 elementary schools. She'd scheduled a dentist appointment for the following week. She'd renewed her lease on the apartment just 2 weeks earlier. These weren't the actions of someone planning to vanish. One detail nagged at Detective Vance, though she couldn't articulate why. According to multiple witnesses, Melissa had seemed distracted in the days leading up to her disappearance. A fellow teacher mentioned that Melissa had been jumpy, startling easily when people approached her desk. She'd been checking her phone constantly, frowning at the screen. When asked if everything was okay, Melissa had smiled and said she was fine, just stressed about job applications. But there was something else, something in her eyes. Fear. Microfonsin, which all written. On April 19th, 16 days after Melissa vanished, a rancher named Thomas Everett made a discovery that turned the missing person case into a homicide investigation. Everett owned 3,000 acres of grazing land about 30 miles northwest of Winnemucca, near the edge of the Black Rock Desert. He'd been checking fence lines on his ATV when he noticed buzzards circling above a dry wash. Lots of them, maybe 20 or 30, spiraling in the thermal currents. He investigated. What he found, partially buried in a shallow grave beneath a scrubby juniper tree, made him turn away and vomit into the dirt. The body was badly decomposed, exposure and scavengers having done their work. but the clothing was intact enough. Jones, the tattered remains of a white sweater, and nearby, half buried in sand, a driver's license with a familiar face staring up from the plastic. Melissa Ann Harding, bare and a urn. The autopsy revealed what the desert had tried to hide. Melissa had been strangled. Manual strangulation, the medical examiner determined, based on the fractures to her hyoid bone. The killer had used their bare hands, squeezing until she stopped breathing. Time of death was estimated within hours of her disappearance, somewhere between 6 and 8 p.m. on April 3rd. There were other findings, details so disturbing that Detective Vance kept them out of the press releases. Ligature marks on Melissa's wrists, bruising that suggested she'd been bound. Trace evidence under her fingernails, indicating she'd fought back. And something else. Something that would become crucial 22 years later, but meant nothing at the time. But a single fiber, caught in the fabric of her sweater. Synthetic. Blue. Unlike anything Melissa owned. The investigation intensified. Every person who'd been in contact with Melissa during her final days was re-interviewed. Polygraph tests were administered. Phone records were analyzed down to the minute. But security footage from businesses near her apartment was collected and reviewed frame by frame. One person emerged as a potential suspect almost immediately. Kyle Mercer, 26, had dated Melissa briefly the previous fall. The relationship had lasted 6 weeks before Melissa ended it, telling friends that Kyle was too intense, too possessive. He'd called her constantly, showed up uninvited at her apartment, grew jealous when she spoke to other men. After the breakup, there'd been incidents. Kyle driving slowly past her apartment at night. Kyle showing up at the school where she worked, claiming he just wanted to talk. A formal complaint had been filed with the police in January 2003, and Kyle had been warned to stay away. On April 3rd, Kyle's alibi fell apart under scrutiny. He claimed he'd been home alone all evening, watching television. But his cell phone records showed he'd been in the area near Melissa's apartment around 6 p.m. When confronted, he changed his story. Okay, yes, he'd driven by her place, but he hadn't stopped. He just wanted to see if she was home. He hadn't talked to her. He hadn't gone inside. Detective Vance brought him in for formal questioning. Kyle sat across from her in the interrogation room, his leg bouncing nervously, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. She asked him about the scratches on his hands, still healing, red and raw. He said his dog did it. When she pointed out he didn't own a dog, he stumbled, said he meant his friend's dog. She asked about the blue jacket he'd been wearing that week, a synthetic windbreaker. Kyle's face went pale. He demanded a lawyer. The case seemed ready to break. But then Kyle's attorney produced something that changed everything. Security footage from a convenience store 60 miles away in Battle Mountain, timestamped at 7:35 p.m. on April 3rd. Clear as day. Kyle Mercer buying beer and cigarettes, his face plainly visible. The timeline didn't work. He couldn't have killed Melissa, transported her body 30 miles into the desert, buried her, and made it to Battle Mountain by 7:35. Unless he'd had an accomplice. But there was no evidence of that. No witnesses. No connection to anyone else who might have helped. The fiber evidence from Melissa's sweater didn't match Kyle's jacket. His car was searched top to bottom. No blood. No trace of Melissa. Kyle Mercer walked free. The case went cold. Years passed. Detective Vance retired in 2008, the Harding case her one great failure. She moved to Oregon, to a small house by the coast, and every year on April 3rd, she lit a candle for Melissa and whispered an apology into the darkness. Richard Harding died of a heart attack in 2011, his wife Susan beside him, both of them never having learned who killed their daughter. Jamie, Melissa's sister, became a victims' rights advocate, speaking at conferences, lobbying for better resources for cold case investigations. The pain never left her eyes. Winnemucca moved on, as small towns do. The Desert View apartments were torn down in 2015, replaced by a storage facility. New families moved in. Young people who'd never heard the name Melissa Harding walked the same streets where volunteers had once searched frantically. The case files sat in storage, forgotten, until technology caught up with the truth. In 2024, the Winnemucca Police Department received a grant to re-examine old cold cases using modern forensic techniques. DNA analysis had advanced exponentially since 2003. What was impossible then had become routine. Detective Michael Torres, young and ambitious, volunteered to review the Harding case. He started with the evidence collected from beneath Melissa's fingernails. The original analysis in 2003 had extracted DNA but couldn't generate a usable profile. Too degraded, the technicians had said. Not enough material. 20 years later, it was more than enough. The sample went to a private lab specializing in genetic genealogy, the same techniques that had cracked the Golden State Killer case and dozens of others. They built a DNA profile, uploaded it to public ancestry databases, and began constructing a family tree. It took 4 months. On March 17, 2025, Detective Torres sat in his office and stared at the name on his computer screen. His hands were shaking. He read it 3 times, certain there'd been a mistake. Then he pulled the original case file, flipped through witness statements, and felt his stomach drop. The DNA under Melissa's fingernails, the skin cells she'd clawed from her killer's arms as she fought for her life, belonged to someone who'd been interviewed extensively in 2003. Someone who'd expressed shock and grief over Melissa's death. Someone who'd helped with the search, who'd comforted the family, who'd attended the memorial service and cried genuine tears. Someone who'd had access to her apartment, who knew her schedule, who'd been trusted completely. The arrest warrant was issued that afternoon. At 6:45 a.m. on March 18th, officers surrounded a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Winnemucca. The property was well maintained, flower beds along the front walk, an American flag hanging from the porch. A silver pickup truck sat in the driveway, a Support Our Teachers bumper sticker visible on the rear window. Detective Torres knocked on the door. Once, twice. It opened. The person standing there looked older now, grayer, lines etched deep around their eyes. But Torres recognized them from the photographs in the case file, recognized them from the witness statements, from the memorial service footage. He said the name. The name. Paul Greenlee. Richard Dove. Paul's face went blank. Not surprised, not confused, just empty. Former guidance counselor at Lowry High School. Melissa's mentor. The person who'd written her recommendation letters for teaching positions. The person who'd been at the school the day she disappeared. Who'd waved goodbye to her at 5 o'clock. Who'd told police he'd gone straight home afterward. The person who'd lied. Because Paul Greenlee had gone to Melissa's apartment that evening. He'd knocked on her door. She'd let him in, trusting, unsuspecting. And something had happened in those terrible minutes that followed. Something that ended with his hands around her throat, her fingernails tearing into his skin, and her life draining away on the floor of her living room, while the groceries sat unpacked on the counter. Detective Torres began reading Paul his rights. The neighbors emerged from their houses, watching in stunned silence as the man they'd known for decades was placed in handcuffs and led to a patrol car. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting denials, insisting there'd been a mistake. Paul didn't resist, didn't protest, but just walked calmly, his expression distant, as if remembering something from long ago. As the car pulled away, Torres stood in the driveway and thought about Melissa Harding, about the young woman who'd dreamed of teaching children, who'd loved her sister, who'd fought so hard in her final moments. Justice was coming. But the question that haunted everyone, the question that would dominate the trial and consume the media coverage, remained unanswered. Why? What could possibly drive a respected educator, a pillar of the community, to murder a young woman he'd mentored and supported? The answer, when it finally emerged, would be worse than anyone imagined. The interrogation room at the Winnemucca Police Department was designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the grey walls. The temperature was kept cool, just enough to keep people alert, uneasy. A metal table sat bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on either side, and a camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. Paul Greenlee sat with his hands folded in his lap, still wearing the handcuffs. His attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Grant from Reno, sat beside him, her briefcase open, legal pad covered in notes. She'd already advised him not to speak, repeatedly, but Paul seemed to exist somewhere else entirely, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. Detective Torres entered carrying a folder thick with documents. He sat down across from Paul and studied the man's face. 62 years old now, grey hair neatly trimmed, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He looked like someone's grandfather, someone who baked cookies and volunteered at church fundraisers. Not a killer. But the DNA didn't lie. Torres opened the folder, pulled out a photograph of Melissa Harding, and placed it on the table between them. The image showed her smiling, vibrant, alive, taken just weeks before her death. Paul flinched, just slightly, but Torres saw it. "Tell me about Melissa," Torres said quietly. Victoria Grant started to object, but Paul raised his hand, silencing her. "She was brilliant," Paul said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. "One of the brightest students I ever worked with. She cared about people, really cared, wanted to make a difference." "You mentored her?" "One. Yes. From her sophomore year through graduation. He helped her choose her major, write her college applications. I was proud of her." Paul's eyes glistened. "So proud." "One, you killed her." "And..." The words hung in the air like smoke. Paul didn't deny it, didn't react at all, just kept staring at Melissa's photograph. Victoria Grant leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Detective, my client hasn't admitted to anything. You have DNA evidence that places them in contact, which could be explained by legitimate interactions. Nothing more." "Nothing more." Torres pulled out another document. The forensic report. He slid it across the table. "Your DNA was found under her fingernails, Paul. Skin cells. Blood. She clawed you while you were strangling her. The scientists can tell the difference between casual contact and violent struggle. This was violent." Paul closed his eyes. "Why were you at her apartment that night?" Torres pressed. "You told investigators in 2003 that you went straight home after school. But you didn't, did you? You went to Melissa's place." Silence. Silence. "What happened, Paul? Did she reject you? Did she figure something out? What could possibly make you kill someone you claimed to care about?" Victoria Grant stood abruptly. "This interview is over. My client will not be answering any further questions." But Paul spoke anyway, his voice barely above a whisper. "She found the photographs." Torres froze. "What photographs?" "The ones I'd been taking. For years. Students. Girls. In the locker rooms, the bathrooms, changing for gym class." Paul's face crumpled. "I had a problem. I knew it was wrong. I tried to stop. God, I tried. But I couldn't." The room went deathly quiet. Victoria Grant looked like she'd been punched in the stomach. Torres felt bile rise in his throat. "Melissa discovered you were photographing students." Paul nodded slowly. "She came to my office that afternoon, April 3rd. She was upset, crying. Said she'd been helping Coach Reynolds organize files in the athletics office and found a box. My box. Hidden in the back of a supply closet. She'd opened it. Then..." The confession spilled out now, 22 years of guilt pouring through the cracks. "She confronted me, asked how I could do this, asked how many girls. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand it was a sickness, that I needed help. She said she was going to the principal, going to the police. She was going to make sure I never worked with children again." Torres gripped the edge of the table. "So you followed her home." I panicked. I drove to her apartment. I just wanted to talk to her, convince her to give me time to turn myself in properly, to get help. She let me inside. We argued. She said there was no amount of talking that would change what I'd done. She reached for her phone to call the police. Paul's hands were shaking now, the handcuffs rattling. I grabbed her wrist, told her to wait, to please just listen. She pulled away, started shouting. I put my hand over her mouth to quiet her, afraid the neighbors would hear, but she bit me, hard, scratched at my face, my arms. I just wanted her to stop screaming, to stop fighting. I squeezed her throat, just trying to make her be quiet for a minute so I could think. Torres felt sick. You strangled her to death. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear to God I didn't mean it. But she went limp, and when I let go, she just collapsed. I checked for a pulse. There was nothing. She was gone. The confession that followed detailed the cover-up with chilling precision. Paul had wrapped Melissa's body in a tarp from his truck. He'd waited until dark, then carried her out through the back entrance of the apartment complex, avoiding the parking lot cameras. He'd driven her body into the desert, to a place he knew from hunting trips years earlier. Buried her in the shallow grave where Thomas Everett would find her 16 days later. Then he'd gone home, burned the clothes he'd been wearing, bandaged the scratches on his arms, and constructed his alibi. The next morning, when Melissa's disappearance became known, Paul had played the concerned mentor perfectly. He'd joined the search parties, comforted her parents. Never once slipped, never once revealed the monster beneath the mask. And the photographs, the evidence of his crimes against countless students, had been destroyed that same night. He'd burned every image, every negative, every hidden camera. He erased the proof of his depravity and carried on, as if nothing had happened. For 22 years, he'd taught students, counseled them, earned awards for his dedication to education, all while Melissa Harding rotted in the desert, her family destroyed, her killer walking free. Detective Torres stood, his legs unsteady. "How many girls did you photograph?" Paul's voice was barely audible. "I don't know, dozens, maybe more. Over 15 years. And you destroyed all the evidence?" "Yes." "When lying to..." Torres wanted to lunge across the table, wanted to make Paul feel a fraction of the terror Melissa must have experienced in her final moments. But he remained professional, controlled. "You are going to prison for the rest of your life," Torres said. "And I'm going to make sure every single person knows exactly what you are." The news exploded across Winnemucca like a bomb. Within hours, Paul Greenlee's arrest was headline news. Not just locally, but nationally. The story had everything. A beloved educator, a cold case solved by modern science, and the horrifying revelation of abuse that had gone undetected for over a decade. Former students began coming forward. The women now in their 30s and 40s, mothers themselves, carrying the trauma of violation they'd never understood. They remembered feeling watched, remembered Coach Reynolds mentioning that supplies kept going missing from the athletics office, remembered Paul Greenlee always being around, always helpful, always trusted. And the school district launched an investigation. Old files were examined, patterns emerged, complaints that had been dismissed, concerns that had been ignored, a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. Jamie Harding, Melissa's sister, held a press conference outside the courthouse. Her hair was gray now, lines of grief etched permanently into her face. But there was something else there too. Relief. Day. Vindication. And rage. Raisbosen. Isindam. "My sister died trying to protect children," Jamie said, her voice steady despite the tears. "She discovered something evil, and instead of staying silent, instead of protecting herself, she chose to do the right thing. It cost her everything. And for 22 years, the man who killed her walked free, continued to work with children, continued to pretend he was a good person." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. But Melissa's fight wasn't for nothing. Because of her courage, Because she found those photographs and confronted him, Paul Greenlee's crimes are finally exposed. She saved countless other children from becoming his victims. She's a hero, and I want the world to know that. The trial began in September 2025. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Portman, presented overwhelming evidence. The DNA, the confession recorded and transcribed, her testimony about strangulation patterns, the timeline analysis placing Paul at the scene, testimony from students describing Paul's suspicious behavior years earlier. The defense had nothing. Victoria Grant tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting Paul had experienced a psychotic break. The jury didn't buy it. The premeditation was too clear and the cover-up too calculated. Witnesses testified about Melissa, her kindness, her dreams, her dedication to education. Those her former students, now adults, described how she'd inspired them. Her friends spoke about the light she'd brought into every room. Jamie took the stand and recounted the agony of not knowing, of spending 2 decades searching for answers. And throughout it all, Paul Greenlee sat silent, expressionless, as if he'd already left his body behind. The prosecution saved their most damning evidence for last. After Paul's arrest, investigators had obtained warrants to search his home, his office, his digital devices. What they found made even seasoned detectives recoil. Because Paul had lied about destroying everything, they hidden in the crawl space beneath his house, sealed in waterproof containers, were backup drives. Thousands of images. Not from the early 2000s, but recent. From 2015, 2018, 2022. Paul had never stopped. Even after killing Melissa, even knowing the risk, he'd continued photographing students. He'd installing hidden cameras in school facilities, collecting his depraved trophies. The courtroom fell silent as this evidence was presented. Several jurors were visibly ill. Paul's attorney looked stunned, betrayed by her own client's lies. In that moment, any lingering doubt vanished. Paul Greenlee wasn't someone who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. He was a predator, a monster who'd weaponized his position of trust to victimize children for decades. And the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, destruction of evidence, and a litany of charges related to his abuse of students, both from 2003 and the years following. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway who'd presided over criminal cases for 30 years, looked at Paul with open contempt. "You were given a sacred trust," she said. The parents sent their children to school believing they would be safe, that the adults in charge would protect them. You violated that trust in the most despicable ways imaginable. You used your position to prey on vulnerable young people. And when someone brave enough to stop you emerged, you murdered her. Mine. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Melissa Harding died a hero. You will die a convicted killer and child predator, life in prison without the possibility of parole. May you spend every remaining day haunted by the faces of those you harmed. Paul was led away in shackles. No tears, no final statement. Just empty compliance, as if judgment had been irrelevant. But the story didn't end there. In the months following Paul's conviction, Winnemucca began the painful process of reckoning with its failures. The school district implemented new safety protocols, mandatory reporting training, background checks for all staff, surveillance systems with oversight committees, changes that should have existed decades earlier. A memorial was erected in Melissa's honor, a scholarship fund established in her name, supporting students pursuing careers in education and child advocacy. Her photograph, the same one Detective Torres had placed on the interrogation table, was displayed in the lobby of the new elementary school. Beneath it, a plaque read, Melissa Ann Harding, teacher, protector, hero. Jamie Harding, now in her 40s, found a measure of peace. She visited Melissa's grave regularly, the headstone now bearing the full truth, beloved daughter and sister, died defending the innocent. The answers she'd sought for 22 years had finally come, and while they brought no joy, they brought closure. Detective Torres continued working cold cases, driven by the knowledge that science and persistence could resurrect justice from even the most frozen investigations. He kept Melissa's photograph on his desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. And in a maximum security prison 300 miles south, Paul Greenlee sat in a cell barely larger than a closet, his life reduced to concrete and steel. Other inmates knew what he was, what he'd done. Prison has its own justice system, and child predators rank at the very bottom. He would not have an easy time. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was the one he'd inflicted upon himself. Because every night, in the darkness of his cell, Paul saw her. Melissa Harding, 23 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, fighting for her life, clawing at his arms, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He heard her final words, spoken before she'd reached for her phone, before everything had spiraled into violence. "You are supposed to protect them." 4 words that condemned him. 4 words that would echo in his mind until his last breath. The desert keeps secrets, yes, but not forever. Eventually the wind shifts, the sand erodes, and the truth, buried deep and patient, claws its way back to the surface. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years. Sometimes, as in Melissa Harding's case, it takes over 2 decades. But it comes. And when it does, when justice finally arrives draped in DNA evidence and technological advancement and the relentless dedication of those who refuse to forget, and it arrives with devastating clarity. Winnemucca learned this lesson the hard way. A town that had trusted blindly, that had allowed a monster to hide in plain sight for 15 years, now carries the weight of that failure. The lawsuits from former students continue. The investigations into how Paul's behavior went undetected persist. The scars, both individual and collective, will take generations to heal. But there's something else too, something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. The renewed commitment to vigilance, to questioning authority when something feels wrong, to believing victims when they speak up, to understanding that evil rarely announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. More often it wears a friendly smile, earns awards for service, and hides behind respectability. Melissa Harding understood this. On April 3, 2003, when she discovered those photographs, she could have walked away, could have convinced herself it wasn't her problem, that someone else would handle it. She could have protected herself by staying silent. She chose differently. And that choice, even though it cost her life, saved others. Because Paul Greenlee's arrest didn't just solve a murder. It exposed ongoing abuse. It stopped a predator who'd continued hunting for 22 years. It validated the instincts of students who'd felt uncomfortable but had been dismissed. It proved that speaking up, even when dangerous, even when terrifying, matters. In the end, that's Melissa's legacy. Not her death, but her courage. Not the tragedy, but the lives she protected by refusing to look away. The case file on Melissa Ann Harding, once buried in a storage room beneath layers of dust and forgotten hope, now sits in the solved section, stamped with red ink, closed. But her story remains open, told and retold, a cautionary tale, an inspiration, a reminder that justice, however delayed, however hard won, is always worth pursuing. Because somewhere out there, in another small town, in another filing cabinet, there's another case going cold, another family waiting for answers, another victim whose voice was silenced, but whose story isn't finished. And maybe, just maybe, the next breakthrough is already coming. The next advancement in forensic science. The next dedicated detective willing to reopen old wounds. The next fragment of DNA waiting to speak truth across the years. The desert keeps secrets, but science, persistence, and the courage of people like Melissa Harding keep bringing them home. 22 years was too long. Justice was too late to save her. But it came nonetheless, dragging a monster into the light and forcing the world to see him for what he truly was. In the small cemetery on the outskirts of Winnemucca, beneath a spreading cottonwood tree, Melissa's grave sits peaceful now. Fresh flowers appear regularly, left by people who never knew her but understand what she represents. Children who grew up hearing her story. Teachers who work every day to honor her memory. Families who sleep easier knowing one more predator has been stopped. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispers through the sagebrush and the shadows grow long, you can almost feel her presence. Not haunting, but watching, not angry, but at peace. Because the truth finally came out. The monster was caged. And Melissa Ann Harding, teacher, sister, daughter, hero, can finally rest.